everyone, and thank you for joining me. I'm Besmira Rraci, an Ayesha Bulchandani Intern, and this talk is a part of the Closer Look series, presented to you by Education at the Frick Collection. I will be sharing with you all an in-depth review of a portrait from 18th century England by an artist named Thomas Gainsborough. Together, let's take a closer look at this portrait of Mrs. Grace Dalrymple Elliott, painted around 1782. This enchanting oil painting on canvas can be found on the 4th floor of the Frick Madison, hanging in the company of other works by Gainsborough and his contemporaries. Immediately, we can sense the elegance of this sitter, who upholds the fashionable trends of late 18th century England. We notice her high and powdered, seemingly soft hair, her bright skin, and a ribbon tied just below her chin that leads our eyes to her lace-trimmed, low-cut dress, a dress that is accented by a prominent jewel pendant in the center of her chest. Now, unlike many of the portraits in the room with Mrs. Elliott, her cheeks are noticeably more flushed. She bears a pink blush just shades lighter than her lip color, where we see her mouth is slightly parted and upturned, forming a subtle smile. Hanging on the same wall as her, we notice how Gainsborough's full-length portraits of Mrs. Peter William Baker, also known by her maiden name, Jane Clitheroe, and the Honorable Francis Duncombe have greater detail and even distinct backgrounds. Mrs. Elliott, whose portrait measures only about 30 by 25 inches, is half-length in comparison, as the painting cuts off around her waist. Unlike her counterparts, she also exists against a dark and plain background. But all of this only offers the viewer a more personal interaction with the sitter, as she rests at eye level and is not distracted by a grand scene behind her. These women also bear a similar expression to each other that contrasts from Mrs. Elliott's. While they look away from the viewer, Mrs. Elliott looks ahead, a less formal style of portrait for women at the time. Although I see her gaze as present but occupied, she looks bravely towards the viewer, not shying away from glances or judgment. Thus, she stands out yet again, but by no means is she demanding to. Although all of these characteristics of Gainsborough's portrait cause the sitter to draw in our attention, she does so gently, with a soft gaze, calling us forward until we just must know, who was she? The young Grace Dalrymple was born into a higher status family, where her father was an attorney general of a Caribbean country. Her parents had divorced when she was young, and after her mother's passing, she attended a convent school. It was recorded that Grace was fashionable, good-looking, and had a tall and lean frame, causing her peers to nickname her Dally the Tall. This attribute can be observed in another painting she posed for by Gainsborough, on view at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Being a full-length piece with greater detail and a somewhat dramatic background, this portrait is much more similar to the aforementioned two. While we may be interested in Gainsborough's formal choices for this piece, and we'll discuss them soon, contemporary viewers had a stronger reaction to Gainsborough's choice of subject. Apparently, she was quoted to be, quote, too charming not to get herself gossiped about, end quote. Mrs. Elliott got married at 17 to a physician 18 years her senior, known as Dr. John Elliott. This marriage ultimately unraveled, as Dr. Elliott gathered evidence to prove his wife's infidelity, leading the couple to a finalized divorce by the time Mrs. Elliott, who kept her ex-husband's last name, was 22. She proceeded to carry out several recorded affairs with high-status men as she traveled between France and England. In fact, this portrait we are looking at now is believed to have been commissioned by her former lover and the alleged father of her daughter, the Prince of Wales, or the future King George IV. That daughter, Georgina, was most likely born just a few months before Grace sat for this portrait. A receipt for the painting was found by Gainsborough's wife for a, quote, head of Mrs. Elliott at £31 10 shillings, end quote. That was intended for the prince, but was never paid for or delivered. Today, that would equate to just over $6,000 US. I would also like to note that although the prince himself had a recorded history of mistresses and several illegitimate children, gender structures pointedly sentenced Mrs. Elliott to a reputation of promiscuity. Leaning into the portrait, Gainsborough's sketch-like technique of painting becomes apparent. We see loose and thin brushstrokes that carry us around her dress, chest, and hair. This particular brushwork of the lace, ribbons, and jewels is beautifully gestural. It also gives the painting a special lightness and vitality that is reflective of the youth, beauty, and unrestrained life of the sitter. This haze, most visible across her neck and chest, and in the light brushstrokes of her sleeves and bodice, is somewhat dreamlike and makes it almost feel as though we are eavesdropping into a seemingly private and seductive encounter between Mrs. Elliott and the lover who commissioned the piece. Unlike the rest of the painting, the most detailed and focused part is her face. Her skin, adorned by a lively glow and flushed cheeks, paired with her pink and slightly agape lips, is accompanied by an unmistakable beauty spot. These spots were often referred to as patches and were thought to be, quote, stratagems of lust, end quote, a feature fitting of Mrs. Elliott's assumed scandalous life. Finally, the color scheme of the piece is mainly pastel, which stands out against the dark background. However, I want to draw our attention to the shapes and arrangement of the painting. Although proportions do not appear to be mismatched, the reoccurring ovular shape that is ultimately connected by the thread tied around her neck can take the viewer's eyes on a ride. The most prominent oval is the one that frames the dark background around Mrs. Elliott, but with your eyes, I urge you to follow the shapes from the top. Mrs. Elliott's head is starkly oval-shaped, and all the more prominently so as a result of her long nose and downward-sloping eyebrows. Looking down the sides of her head, we notice the oval-shaped earrings that shine at opposite ends of her face. Tracing further towards the tip of her chin, we slide down the black ribbon on her neck as it leads us to the oval pendant that sits between the bow that droops from the center of her dress. All of these patterns and orientation that it takes the viewer on makes for a uniquely pleasurable experience when interacting with this piece. Through her beauty and her scandal, Grace Dalrymple Elliott is a figure that has inspired memoirs, novels, and even a film about her life. As we reach the conclusion of this talk, I invite you to look again at Mrs. Elliott, but this time from the entryway of the gallery room. Where the other portraits are looking sharply left or right, or shrouded in flowers or ornate backgrounds, Mrs. Elliott, bold against the dark tones behind her, glances towards the entryway, inviting us all to come in, creating a subtle yet intimate connection that draws you to take the steps towards her. Thank you all for taking a closer look with me at Gainsborough's portrait of Mrs. Grace Dalrymple Elliott.